This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Thank you, Michelle, for a lovely introduction. I must say it's very easy to teach with energy and to do all that research when the material that you work with and the students you work with are so good, and Stanford is such a good university to be at. You know, I listen to that list and I think, oh, it's not me, it's the people and the universities and the students who've supported me that helped me do all of that. I had fun doing it. So let me talk today about teaching. I want to thank Michelle for inviting me to reflect on my teaching. She knows that she asked me 2 or 3 times to participate in this series, and I always sort of demurred, saying, well, there's nothing I do teaching that's special, really, because when you've been teaching as long as I have, you begin to think it's the most natural thing in the world, and you don't really notice what you do. But I got thinking about it and realized that the one thing that probably characterizes all of the teaching I do is that I integrate writing into all of the courses I teach. And so that's what I decided I would tell you about today. So let me start with some general principles. Students learn best when they're engaged, and nothing jumpstarts that process of engagement than having to write about something. But writing well, meaning mastering a topic and clarifying the argument and defending your position, doesn't often come on the first try. I think you probably all know that. It takes many stages of writing and many types of engagement: outlines, drafts, conversations, and hard thinking. So I ask students to do lots of kinds of writing in my various courses, even lecture courses and certainly small group discussion courses. And I do that with the goal of pushing the students for bolder arguments and greater clarity of expression. I really want to support students in becoming more confident thinkers. And in the process, I want to help them become better writers. In other words, I don't teach writing per se in my classes. I use the writing to help them to think historically, and you can do that in your own disciplines. So my commitment to using writing to become a better historical thinker doesn't really come from a personal experience, even though I went to a wonderful small liberal arts college. I wrote a lot of papers there. I don't remember them as being particularly growing experiences, although I had great teachers, of course. The experience that I keep coming back to when I think about how I learned to write well historically was a kind of trial by fire in graduate school, which was that I was working in the most important class a graduate student in history in grad school has to do, which is a research seminar, and the professor, a totally intimidating person, had told us we had to write a 25-page publishable paper. So I had a great topic, I did wonderful research, and I wrote up a 40-page paper. And I went to the professor with 2 days before the due date and said, you know, my paper's a little longer, could I make it a bit longer? And he paused and thought and said, well, maybe 26 pages. I thought, oh golly, Professor Pipe says 26 pages, you don't give him 40. So I had 2 days to do something about this, and I knew I couldn't just take out every third word and get 15 pages and make it the same paper and make it good. So I'm a historian. I had written this paper chronologically. It was a study of a journalist in mid-19th century Russia and his many publications, and I'd done it chronologically, and I knew that that was a sort of inefficient way. So I rewrote the whole paper from scratch thematically. The chronology got embedded into the various themes. It became a far better paper. It was 25 pages on the dot. I got a straight A from a professor who never gave straight A's. I amazed myself. I think I amazed him too. And I learned the moral of the story, which is that there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat. There are many ways to make a historical argument or make a strong argument in an interpretive essay, and some ways are rhetorically better than others. So in your discipline, you may not have such a clear-cut distinction as we historians do between a chronological approach or a thematic approach, but you will know in your discipline what are different rhetorical strategies and which work best. And I think what's important for us as teachers is to challenge students to use the rhetorical strategy that creates the strongest paper. And that often requires that they think and think again about how they're approaching their topic, and that they rewrite. You know, what I find in my courses is that Stanford students, it's a cliche, they are very smart, they're very hardworking, and I find they have very good basic writing skills, most of my students. They know how to craft sentences, they know how to craft good 5-paragraph essays. But the content of their essays can be a little bland. Particularly, you know, it takes a while in history to really learn enough to feel confident of your own opinions. So what I find is that I'm always encouraging them to write interesting papers, to pose the question that's interesting. And I'm always pushing them to get more engaged in the material rather than taking the safest, most obvious way through it. And that means hard work. So the first extended example I want to give you is how I work with papers in my courses. I know I'm told that in this series the audience likes to hear specific examples of what works in classrooms. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about at the greatest length, I think, is how I work with papers in my various classes. In all of my classes, even the lecture course, I assign a paper, 6 to 8 pages for a lecture course, maybe a little bit longer in a colloquium. And this is in addition to tasks that you have to have in various kinds of courses like midterms and final exams and map quizzes or oral reports and things like that. The kind of paper, sometimes in a colloquium type paper, I will assign a research sort of paper with an open-ended topic, but even there I don't keep the topic very open-ended because the quarter system simply militates against that, and I think any of us working in the humanities knows that there's very little time to send the student off to the library with a glimmer of an idea and have them browse the stacks for a week or two narrowing down a topic. So I often give them very tightly defined topics and initial bibliography and set them off fast. But most of the time, particularly in the lecture course, I have them write book reviews because that's a project that controls itself. The monograph is a limited version, and although they may have to read a little around it, it's not a very open-ended assignment. And so it fits the quarter system. It also seems to encapsulate what we historians do in my discipline. That is, as historians, we assess each other's arguments and comment on them. And that's the habit of mind that I want undergraduate students, let alone graduate students, to develop. So basically, my students are usually asked to review a historical monograph. So many of them often do this. They sum up the book, and then they manfully try to critique it, and by that they think negative, even though I tell them in advance it doesn't have to be negative. They're always looking for the fatal flaw. There's some mistake in this book. So they often get caught up in sort of minor complaints that the prose is too dense or the professor left out such and such a topic. So I try to urge them to pull back and say, you know, what's really going on in this book? What's at stake and why the author even chose this argument, or what is the argument the author's making, and how does it link in with the other things we're learning in our class? How can you make sense of this material in a way that's a little bit bigger and broader than just what the author did too? And I tell them, too, that most published books are really good. They wouldn't be published if they weren't good, and so you don't have to find the fatal flaw, but you still need to marshal critical abilities in order to explain and analyze why it's a strong and successful book. And so I always require them to write these papers in a first draft and a final draft. And then I give them feedback on the draft. And that, in a nutshell, is actually the requirement for the writing in the major requirement here in the university. If any of you are involved in that in your departments, you know that you're required to do substantive amounts of writing, write in a draft, professor gives feedback, and the student does revision in at least one stage, if not more, in the course. But I do this in all my classes. I can't stand to accept papers that haven't been revised at least once at this point, you know, because it simply, as you must know, produces a much better paper. Logistical detail, I always tell the students that that first draft has to be a full version of their argument. No, it's not an outline with to be filled in around the topic sentence. It has to be a full version. It doesn't have to be perfect in terms of footnote or anything like that, but it should be something that I can then respond to in an intellectual way. And I make clear to them that I don't grade the draft. It's mandatory, they have to do it, but they don't get graded on it, they just get responses to it. And so then I give them extensive critique on the drafts, written and then sometimes following up in oral form. In practice, I find that it's hard to just mandate that everybody come in and talk to me about their paper before or after the paper is due. I think it's hard to do that. Logistically, it's hard, and it's hard because some students find they want to talk before the paper and some want to talk to you after they've gotten the comments. So at this point, I tend to just exhort them to come in and talk with me at whatever stage of the paper, more than once, of course, if they want to, but whatever works for them. I don't make it mandatory, but you could. It's just another burden on your time. This whole process is, if you hadn't noticed before, rather time-consuming. let me tell you a bit about what I do in responding to their papers. I don't respond to their writing style to the extent that one can define what a writing style is, but I don't, work too hard to say, well, I don't know, talk about the writing in general. That comes out, I guess, in the wash, in the long run. What I do, is I read through, I comment on punctuation, I comment on tone of voice, I comment on maybe misuse of vocabulary, something like that. That's sort of the sort of stuff you do as you read through when you're really looking for the argument, and I jot all those comments down as I'm also tracking the structure of argument. But really, basically, I go for the argument in the paper. First, I ask, does the paper have an argument? And is that argument suggested in the beginning? Not necessarily in full, but it hinted at in the beginning. So you pique the reader's curiosity. And then does the argument march forward? I'm always telling students that the paper should have pace, and it should be a fast pace, that it should drive to a conclusion, that you're dragging your reader along with you, that you're marching to a kind of well-rounded ending. So I'm constantly looking at transitions between paragraphs. Does the author wrap up a thought and yet insert a little bit of a hint at the end of a paragraph that kind of sets you up for the next paragraph, and then does the next paragraph start with just the tiniest little hint that connects those two, so that you really feel like you're being, you know why you're going somewhere, and you know you're going somewhere. And I often find myself writing in on these comments to the students at the end of their paragraphs the word "so," with a question mark. I try not to make it look too rude, but because often students give you a lot of material and they don't wrap it up enough so you know why you needed that paragraph's worth of material, how it contributes to the argument. And I often then also look architectonically. I pull back and say, is this organized in the right way? Would I take this cluster of paragraphs and put it at the end? And I, sometimes get very elaborate, suggesting that they move things around because they've got the pieces, but maybe it didn't flow in the way I hoped it would flow or expected that it would flow. And then I pull back, having gotten to the end of sort of stream of consciousness reading, then I pull back and try to give them synthetic comments on what I think they argued in the paper and how they might push that argument to be a little deeper and richer. Now, this, of course, is very hard work. It takes me about a half an hour per paper. I used to do it on their hard copies, pass back the hard copy. This year, just to give you a little logistical, practical info about how I do it, this year I started doing it on that feature in Word called Track Changes, if any of you know that. So they submit their paper as an email attachment, you open it up, you turn on Track Changes, and then you start, editing on the screen. And your editing comes up in all these different colors. Blue and yellow, you can highlight in yellow. Marginalia comes in over here of things that you've changed, so that the author, the reader of what you send back to the student can immediately see what you've inserted and suggested. You can highlight, you can add comments, that sort of thing. So it makes it a little bit easier and faster. The student can immediately see what you've done to suggest the editing. But it can also be overwhelming. You can go to town on that software capability and put a lot of suggestions in, and it can get overwhelming for the student. So I always at the end write a synthetic response. As I said just before I start, saying, in this paper you've argued X, Y, and Z. Wonderful work on this. I always try to give some sort of praise about what's strong, how it holds together, and then, now you might think about doing this, or maybe you might pose this question. That sort of thing, to ask them to make the paper bolder, make the paper a stronger argument. And that's where it gets a little difficult and delicate. It's a bit of a delicate balance here. The students always appreciate, I think, your comments, and they're often surprised to get the page worth of narrative that I give them. They're flattered. Students sometimes have said to me they really feel empowered. They'll say things like, "You mean I really can say this about that book? I soft-pedaled that. I can say this about that famous author," and I'll say, "Yeah, it's a valid critique." And they'll feel empowered to go beyond. That's great. But the students are also, a little confused about the power differential here. After all, they're going to get graded on this paper, and the professor has just given them a barrage of commentary. And so I try to, reassure them that they don't have to do what I say, right? That it has to be their own paper. I try to give them very open-ended suggestions. You might want to do this. You could consider this. One other approach is that. Try to give them a variety of things to do without mandating. And in class, I tell them, and I think on the syllabus I even write this, that they don't have to do what I tell them, that my reaction is just a good-hearted reader, an informed reader. It's one of many reactions. They should have other people read their paper and get more reactions. And then they should write the paper that's their own. And if what I say doesn't make sense to them, then don't use it. I'll tell you one other anecdote that I do remember from my college days, which was just the absolute opposite of what I just said, which is that I did a book review in a course in Russian history. And it was not in drafts, but the professor came back to me and he said, you're a really good student. I want you to do well in this course, but you totally missed the point of this book. So you better rewrite it and get the point right. And I thought, okay. It was a biography, a very funny biography of Boris Godunov, the 16th century Russian Tsar. And my professor said, you missed the point that this 19th century Russian historian turned Boris into a kind of constitutional liberal. Because that's what he wanted to see out of Boris in the 16th century. You missed that point. So you got to rewrite the paper. So I rewrote the paper and I said, yeah, okay, Platonov shows Boris was a liberal. But it wasn't, I was slavishly doing it because the professor told me that was the right thing. And I felt very odd. It wasn't my paper. I didn't feel right getting the better grade that he gave me. It was just sort of all the wrong thing. So I'm very sensitive to that concept that you don't want to be preaching to your students and mandating that they do something that you expect them. And I tell them over and over again, I don't grade you on obedience about whether you did what I said in your first draft. I actually just read the draft of the final, the final version. I've often forgotten totally what was in the first draft. I don't remember. I don't even notice if they revised a lot or not. I just read it straight up. Is it a good, strong paper with a strong argument that is a compelling read? And I just hope they get that message. I'm sure there's still a lot of awkwardness in some students' minds of, well, I can't really ignore what this professor said. So that's the delicate balance you have to strike in giving this kind of extensive critique. And I suspect that if I built into my classes peer review or other forms of review, they would be getting so many voices telling them different things about their papers, then maybe they would feel more confident that, okay, I got to make this my own because there's more than just the professor's advice. And I have recently been thinking a lot about how to build peer review into this process. In a lecture class, it's really hard. You're doing so many other things. So anyway, all of my classes have this energetic interlude in the last third of the class. They're submitting the first drafts. I'm responding frenetically. You have to set aside time in your own schedule to know you'll be on that computer with each person's paper for several hours of your time. And then they come back in emails and office hours to discuss their feedback. So it is a lot of work. One last logistical comment on on the papers. I always, if I'm being good, I always do this from past experience. I spot check their footnotes for accuracy. This is something historians care about, but I think you should, and all disciplines should care about accuracy of citation. I don't bother to check the internet for plagiarism of these papers. I can't imagine there are very many book reviews of obscure monographs in early modern Russian history floating around on the internet. I could be wrong, but I don't think my students plagiarize like that. But I think that oftentimes they don't understand the varieties of plagiarism, and they do things like they slavishly borrow or track another author's argument, even with citation, but they do it too thickly, and that that should be noticed and commented, or they're a little sloppy in citation of verbatim quotes. And if you make the effort to spot check footnotes and show students that it matters and it matters to you and it's important, then I think that sends them the message that they need to be vigilant on that score. I think once in 20 years at Stanford I had intentional plagiarism in my courses, but I find a lot of sloppiness around the edges. So I want to give you one extended example of a paper that I had in a course last quarter, and then move on to two different other kinds of writing that I do in my courses. Last quarter I had, this is just a nice example because the book was so fun. I had a student do a review of a book called Publishing, Printing, and Intellectual Life in 18th Century Russia. And it was a good first draft. She made really good points about how the author shows the growth of the book industry over the 18th century. This is between Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, if any of you know Russian history. And she showed the shift that the state, from the state controlling all the printing presses to more and more of an open press. And she showed that the author shows changing rates of literacy in Russia in the 18th century, and some really interesting data about changing book tastes and book purchasing. And then also she showed that the state eventually imposed censorship on these presses. And she praised the author for his extensive research and good charts and interesting tables, but she wrote it all kind of in a vacuum, never posing the question of sort of why this is important. The book is entitled Publishing, Printing, and Intellectual Life, and her review was about the publishing and printing without her thinking about, so how does it all add up to intellectual life and why is that important? Many of you, depending upon what discipline you're in, will know exactly what kind of discourse that book belongs to. So I wanted to tell her about that. And this is in the book too. She just sort of missed it because it's pretty overwhelming reading a historical monograph in a field that you're new to. So she missed the point that this author is really sort of posing the big question about the public sphere. That whole concept that says that in the 18th century French Enlightenment, when you get publishing and printing and newspapers and voluntary associations and coffee houses and Freemason lodges and places like that where people can get together and talk, and literacy is broad enough that it trickles down to deeper social classes, then you can create a public sphere that creates public opinion that the state then has to respond to, and you have a more dynamic political life. And of course Habermas argues that willy-nilly throw in a little economic discontent ends up with the French Revolution. So the stakes are pretty high in the development of printing, literacy, and intellectual life in 18th century Enlightenment European conditions. And that certainly was on the mind of the author of this book. And my students simply couldn't encompass all those different layers of meaning in this course, in that book, in the first time through. That's why you need drafts. And so I think I talked with her as well as sending her written comments, and I told her a little bit about Habermas and a little bit about the concept of public sphere, and I pointed out to her readings in our course that were going to be coming up in a couple of weeks that she could read up on. And I think I sent her, I Xeroxed for her a few pages from an encyclopedia on public sphere and just sort of said, think a little more broadly about this concept, see if you see it in the book again, revisit that book and see if that makes any sense to you. So she did do, the extra reading. She read more on Catherine the Great and the Enlightenment in general, and she recrafted the paper, not a whole lot, because she had all the building blocks there. She had all that information about what the author does in the book, but now she knew why she was using it. She made an argument more that had to do with Catherine the Great as enlightened despot and the dilemmas Catherine faced, seeing the Pandora's box of printing explode in front of her, and it became a much more thoughtful and interesting paper. She sort of leaped off from this book into a little bit more broad discussion about the Enlightenment in Russia in general. So it was a great transformation. That's exactly what you want to see between a first and a final draft, that the student really pushes themselves. And she made that argument her own. I don't think I just, fed her public sphere and she reproduced Habermas. I mean, she really, made it her own, really. So often in the books that I steer students to books that are easy to review and have good, strong arguments, and often there's that kind of transformation that can come if you give them the time and the necessity of doing successive drafts. So that's all I'll say about student papers. There are two other ways I use writing in my class teaching that I wanted to tell you about. One is reading logs and one is oral reports. Reading logs, some people call them reading responses. I think some people call them journaling. I've never really talked to other professors about how they use the model. For me, it's not, well, let me tell you what I ask them to do. I mandate that students write what we call a log, a reading response, every single week in the lecture course to a couple of assigned readings, 2 or 3. 1 page per assigned reading. And sometimes it's a primary source, and sometimes it's a short article, maybe in an anthology. And these logs are supposed to be their reactions to the readings, but I don't want an emotional reaction. That's why I don't really call it journaling. I don't, want to ask them just to, react. I actually want it to be a kind of a mini essay writing experience. So I provide them in advance with a template. For primary sources, I tell them, somewhere in your that 1-page response, you should be identifying the primary source and linking it to other things we've been learning about in the course, time, place, significance, that sort of thing. And for secondary articles, I say you should always start with a summary of the author's argument, even in this little assignment, and then react to the argument by linking it to other things you already know from in the course. And so these are sort of mini interpretive essays. And again, they submit them by email, and I respond using the same word function I just described to you. I don't ask them to rewrite them, but in my responses to them, again, I try to push them. I raise perspectives they might have raised, and I comment on their writing. And I often, at the end of it, since these are successive week after week after week, I give them a little challenge for the next one. Next week, try not to use such colloquial language, or next week, try to use some quotations from the primary source to give your prose more authority, or next week, try to really nail down the author's argument, so that it's a kind of a small steps towards building a style of historical analytical writing. And the students, this is the last quarter was the first time I used that particular method, and the students on the evaluations, which we just received back, actually said, begrudgingly, that having to do that discipline every week in the long run really helped them, because they made them do the reading and keep up, and then of course the lectures make more sense and things like that. So I think for lots of reasons, if only to get them to do the reading, but also because it's writing a lot in little structured formats is good practice. I will continue using that model, and the email makes it really easy. And finally, oral reports. I had a wonderful experience teaching last year, using oral reports and realizing how helpful that whole approach was in raising perspectives on rhetoric to students. Because if you build an oral report and a written component into a lecture course, then into a more likely a seminar course, students will really realize, the medium is the message, and different rhetorical strategies have to be used for oral and for writing, and they do it themselves, and they see it right up front. So you can do this in any kind of a seminar small group course if you've got the time to build in for the oral reports and the feedback you should give students on their oral presentation as well as their written work. I do this in the context of a course where it's actually all about the writing. This course that I do is not only a freshman seminar, but it's a freshman seminar that fulfills the university's requirement Power 2, which is rhetoric plus oral communication skills. That is, the emphasis in that course is supposed to be on writing in different media, particularly oral. And so in this particular class, I have students do 2 short oral presentations and 1 long one. So maybe 10 minutes for the short one, 20 minutes for the long one. But the long one is a presentation of a paper that they have done research on and that they will then have to write up as a, say, 15-page paper. And in class, we regularly talk about the differences between effective oral presentation and effective written presentation. And so then I provide them with various kinds of feedback. When they do their oral presentations, I send them by email as soon as I can. I take notes in class as they're talking, and I send them oral response, a little bit on their logistics, although we often have a lot of fun in that class where all the students, in a positive, supportive manner, provide feedback to each other about what worked and what didn't work on your presentation. And students were really good at that kind of feedback. And also, to those classes are assigned oral communication specialists from the CTL to work individually with the students. And in all of your classes, you can go to the CTL and find the resources of oral communications mentors who can help your students as well. So I don't give them too much feedback on the logistics of how they presented themselves in oratory. But rather, I try to concentrate on what was the content of their oral presentation as argument. You know, did they communicate a strong argument? Did they make it well? Did they wrap it up well? A little bit of an aside, in that class we always set aside time for the students to give questions to the speaker. I tell the students that that's as much of a sort of intellectual skill to develop, of how to sort of comprehend an oral presentation and give questions back to it, that's as important a skill as any of the others we're learning. So we always build in 5 or more minutes for student questions, and I'm always urging the students, come on, questions, come on, questions. And they eventually, you know, get better at it, actually. But then the clincher for this course is that they're working on this long paper and they give the long oral report, and the paper is supposed to be in first draft and final draft, and the oral report comes somewhere there in the middle there. And by doing the long oral report on the topic of the research paper, they learn right up front that you have to do these things in different rhetorical strategies. They know that if you have your paper, 15 pages, and you walk up to the podium and try to extemporize around those 15 pages and fit it into a 15-minute presentation, it usually won't work, because oral presentation requires a more skeletal structure and more repetition and more sort of bold presentation of your arguments and less dense prose than you would want in a written form. And if you tried to take your notes for your oral report and just sort of write it up as your paper, it wouldn't be good either, because they're very different kinds of writing. I'm sure you all understand that, but they live it and see it unfolding in front of them in other people's presentations as well as their own. So I really would urge you to build oral reports into your seminar type papers with this kind of feedback and different kinds of writing, because then it tests and challenges students to think in different ways about the very same body of material and the very same questions that they're posing. I might say a few words about little things I do in classes, midterms and finals, but I don't think it's particularly original, but I would simply say that over the years I've come very dissatisfied with midterm exams because they're so short. 50 minutes is not enough time to write a good essay, so I often give students questions in advance that survey the material, make them do that discipline of surveying the course so far in a lecture course, and then they write on one of the 4, say, given things, so that then they write one single 50-minute essay and have the chance to get somewhat in depth, having already surveyed the course material. And that works pretty well for midterms and reviewing course material up to that point in the course. I do similar sort of take-home final exam in lecture courses, but it's less satisfactory because it's hard to pose a question for a take-home final that encompasses an entire lecture course. And so the students invariably end up tilting to one body of material or another. But I figure it's more important to give them the opportunity to really synthesize and learn and focus on some important part of the course than to test them point by point on 100% of the course material if I had the choice between the two. So, and then I often in those take-home exam questions pose something that makes it fun to write, often role-playing sorts of assignments, you know. You're a Polish nobleman sitting in a cafe in Warsaw in the middle of the Polish rebellion of 1791, and you're writing to your friend in France who's in the middle of the French Revolution, and you're telling him what's going on in Warsaw, or something like that. And that kind of role-playing often helps students warm to the writing task of synthesizing a sort of interpretive essay. So that has often worked out to be fun. So I want to conclude now. I don't want to take the whole 50 minutes and ask if you have questions, but I will conclude with a few more just comments and summary. You know, why would you put this much effort into teaching a course in your discipline where you already have a large body of material to put forward? You know, you're not teaching the writing. Why would you put in this much effort? And the points I've sketched out as we've gone along, but I'll repeat some of them. That is, first of all, the students will learn better some of the course material if they actually have to write about it. So if you assign reading logs, for example, they'll read that material and they'll learn it better and they'll be able to use it better. And it's just pedagogically much more intense that way. More generally, by using a lot of writing, you can train the students in the skills of your discipline, even while in the course you're conveying a lot of other sort of information. In my history courses, for example, by doing a lot of writing, I want the students to get into a habit of mind that is analytical. I want them to get into a habit of mind of thinking historically and analytically. I want them, when they read the newspaper, let alone history books, to be looking for the author's argument and the author's voice, instead of just buying the author's presentation as some sort of truth. I want them to see books and articles as artifacts, as products of the author's intellectual curiosity and products of the author's judgments about what to put in and what not to put in, not as some sort of prepackaged, naturalized, innate historical body of knowledge. Everything that they read in the field of history is written by someone who has shaped it according to their own interests and argument. And this is a habit of mind that will help them in more than just their history courses, and I hope to have them learn that both with those little reading logs as well as in the larger book reviews. And another payoff in putting this much effort into writing in a disciplinary course is that students take themselves more seriously as intellectuals. With the feedback and all of the revision, they can challenge themselves and feel comfortable challenging themselves to come up with the most interesting angle on the material, or a deeper level of analysis, or a little more theory, or a little more comparison, or whatever works best in their given case. But they really are empowered and freed to really make the paper their own, particularly simply by giving them more time to think about it and let it mature, in addition to all of the feedback that you give them. And the final payoff, of course, is that you too get much more closely engaged in your students' thinking and in their active learning than you would otherwise. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Could you give us a rough idea of when you're teaching, about how much time you set aside for grading these writing assignments every week? Just a ballpark.
Well, on the little logs, I think it would take, 20 minutes to half an hour per log, depending on how much I'd assign that week. If it was just 2 selections, that's a little less than 4. And so that was it was a bigger burden, actually, than I'd realized. And I shared it with my TA, because the TA can certainly do that sort of thing, because the TA is also reading those sources and knows enough to be able to write. Some weeks we both gave reactions to the students, maybe first and last weeks, but we ended up, I had about 18 students in a lecture course last quarter, and 18 of those would take you forever, so we split it up. But the book reviews I do myself, because it's not really fair to ask the TA to read all those books, and presumably I've read them all. So they take about a half an hour each, at least.
You actually opened the door to the question that I had, which was if in your larger classes there was a role for graduate students to be involved in giving feedback, and not only the point you raised as well as helping you with some of the time and sharing that burden, but have you found the need or the desire or the relationship to develop the graduate students as in their ability to critique and to grade writing, and how is that?
Yeah, I think I should probably do that more systematically, because I found myself every once in a while forwarding my comments on a student paper to the TA, because I knew he'd read that book and I wanted him to see sort of what I'd done, what the student did and what I had done, as a model, as he would know the context. And so, yeah, I think it probably would be a good thing to add to his burden, the TA's burden, whenever he has read one of those books, to actually do a second or do the primary response. Because I just think it's, for historians, we read so much, we analyze. It's a really important thing to kind of go into your teaching career thinking that you're going to take seriously writing, and you're going to use writing to help you get, help you train your students. So yeah, I think it should probably be something that you work with your TAs on. And I think, you know, I'm fortunate. I'm in early modern Russian history. My classes aren't that large, so I can usually encompass the amount of students I have. I think, you know, if you had 100 people in a lecture course with 3 TAs and all of that, you probably couldn't do papers with revisions and drafts in a lecture course. But you certainly can in all of your small group courses. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question to go back to your I like your idea about saying that the suggestions that you give on drafts are suggestions and not something that they have to initially incorporate into the final draft. Have you ever had, I teach a class where there's drafting as well, and I ran into this problem where if some of my suggestions are truly suggestions and some are, you have a problem, here's one way to fix it, you could take another, but you got to fix it. So you run into problems where, you know, you could say, for example, there's a structural problem here. You offer a possible solution. They disagree with that solution and they don't fix it. Well, on the final draft, that's going to...
Right. It's going to look like you're punishing them, but it's really, yeah, I've often thought about that, but it's often you just, you know, if it produces a final paper that still is, you know, not as strong and hard to read and has that same flaw, the flaw is going to be there, you know, so you've done your best to avert it. So, and I guess you're right, there are some ways in which you can really insist, like if the student really doesn't have an argument, you know, the paper is a discrete bunch of discussions that don't really have a flow, then you can really say, this is great, first pass through, this is what first drafts are about. You can praise them for encompassing the material, and then say, now's the time to put in the argument. So you can be pretty categorical on some basics like that. But in terms of actually the interpretation they take, you know, you want to step back. But yeah, and then you just really have to force yourself, when you read the final version, to have a sort of clear mind, you know, and not bring in these, you know, I remember that first draft and I hope they did X, Y, and Z, or I would have written this review this way. You know, you try to take it as, you know, is this a successful paper? Is it compelling?